Did I mention that Joseph was shrewd? As we come now to chapter 47 of our ongoing verse by verse look through the book of Genesis, we come now to chapter 47 where there are essentially two things going on. One, we have the continuation of the outworking of Joseph's plans related to his awareness of what was going on, or what was going to be happening because of this famine. If we remember, we tend to think, oh, isn't it wonderful of Joseph that he had the wisdom and the foresight, having been given foresight, to store grain during the 7 good years. And we think that's quite wonderful of him. But now, as things are getting near the end of the 7 years of famine, we see Joseph taking advantage of others with respect to this prediction. It sort of reminds me of, that temptation when you know the future, whether it's like from the Back to the Future movie. If you remember, was it part 1 or part 2? Somewhere along the line. Yeah, I guess it was part 2. In part 2, Biff had become very powerful and wealthy because he had known the various and sundry sports scores between 1955 and 1985 and was able to lay down bets that were sure things. Well, here's what Joseph is doing. He knows what's coming. He knows the circumstances. He's prepared for them. And it's not simply that out of that knowledge he has made it possible for he and his family and his countrymen to eat, but he is actually using this catastrophe to accumulate unmeasurable wealth for his boss. Well, how does he do it? Well, first he taxes that overage that happened in the 7 good years. That's collected. It's brought in. Now it belongs to the Pharaoh. And then when the bad years come, he turns around and sells it to the very people, some of them, who grew it. But now, as they come again to purchase, he doesn't just take their money. He does take their money until he has essentially all the money in the land. And when that's finished, he takes all of their livestock. And when that's finished, he takes all of their future harvests, or not all of it, but a healthy percentage of their future harvests. This is Joseph taking advantage. Does it remind you of anybody? Certainly, we see Joseph exhibiting some qualities or characteristics of his earthly father. That Jacob was the sneaky one. It's like they're a family of con men. And now Joseph is, on the one hand, it depends on who you are. If you're Pharaoh, you're loving the wisdom and the foresight of Joseph. If you're one of these starving Egyptians, not so much. You're a little bit frustrated at this difficult situation. But that's what Joseph has going on. He is accumulating the wealth of this nation, and meanwhile, his family is doing just fine in the land of Goshen. In fact, they're not just doing well. They're, as the text says here, they're fruitful and they multiplied greatly. Now, Jacob is here for a total of 17 years when it comes time for him to die. And this brings us to the second part of chapter 47, the briefer of the two parts. There's more detail about Joseph and his dealings than there is about Jacob. But here we have Jacob knowing that he's going to die, and he makes a very interesting requirement of his son Joseph. He wants Joseph to swear to do something. Well, what is that something? Well, some people, when they get old, they are quite comfortable making very specific plans for what should happen when they pass away with respect to their remains. There are other people who take the position, I don't care what you do with me, I'm not going to be there, it doesn't matter, don't waste any money. There's different perspectives on this. I've asked Lisa to just make sure there's a bagpiper, because I think I'd like that, although of course I won't be there. But what Jacob asks of Joseph is not how he should be buried, but from one perspective, that he should not be buried, from another, where he should be buried. Jacob is looking forward to more of the fulfillment of God's promises. Because what he says to Joseph is, do not bury me here. Everything's going well in Egypt. The family is prospering. The family is multiplying and increasing. Joseph is still in this position of power. He's using this power to bless his boss. And Jacob's saying, look, as good as things are going here, you need to promise me that my body will not be left here. Now, this is a man who understands the reality and the scope and the blessing of the promise of God with respect to the promised land. He believes in the promises. And he says to Joseph, you've got to take me with you when the time comes for us to depart from this land, because God said we were going to be in this land, and God said we were going to be in this land for some time. In fact, God said already that we're going to be enslaved. God said this and God said that, and everything that God has said, everything that God has promised, whether it was something good or whether it was something bad, whether it was something good for some people and bad for other people, whatever it was that God said has come to pass. I have bowed down to you, Joseph. Your brothers have bowed down to you, Joseph. Just as the dream predicted. All of God's promises have come to pass, are coming to pass, and will come to pass. And when they come to pass, my son, I want my bones to be there. Now, once again, I want to remind you that when you're reading any text in the Bible, if you're able to, you'll do a much better job of understanding that text if you not only remember who is present in what's going on in the story, but if you'll keep in mind who's telling the story and who's listening to the story and in what context the story is being told. Which means we have to go back once again to remember this, that while these events happened during the life of Jacob, at the end of his life, and during the life of Joseph, these events were told during the life of Moses. While Jacob spoke to Joseph, the story itself is being told by Moses to the descendants of Jacob and Jacob's children and Joseph. And those descendants are in the midst of their travel, having left this land, on their way to the promised land. Don't you think? I got a confession to make. I really don't know precisely the methodology that Moses used to spread the word. I have this vision of Moses sitting around a campfire and the children of Israel also sitting around that campfire. And then I realized, there's millions of them. A couple million people probably are not going to be heard as Moses tells a story around the campfire. If I had to guess, Moses would communicate these stories as he's working on the books of the Bible here. He would communicate these stories to people in positions of leadership who would pass them down onto the tribes, and the tribes leaders would pass them down to the families, and the families would pass them down to their wife and to their children. That's my best guess. But there's something in me in this particular story that I want to imagine Moses almost giving a wink when he's telling this story. I have this idea that he's sort of smiling, that he's grinning. It's dark out and I can't see him real well, but he's saying, our father Jacob said to our father Joseph, take my bones with you. And then he sort of gives this little wink. And I imagine everyone who's hearing this when Moses tells this story, I imagine that many of them may be looking past Moses, maybe looking behind Moses, maybe looking around, trying to remember when was the last time they had seen Jacob's ossuary. Now, what's an ossuary? Well, an ossuary is a box, typically made out of clay of some kind, but it's a box that was used to contain the bones of those who had passed away after their flesh had come off of them. This was a common practice. In fact, one of the most exciting things that I saw, and that's saying a lot given the long list of deeply and profoundly exciting things that I saw. One of the most exciting things that I saw, it was on my second trip to Israel, was an ossuary. You might not think that's very exciting to see an ossuary. It's just a kind of clay box. But this particular ossuary that I saw, and I don't know how they know these things for sure. I know that the name was written on it, but I know that some names are pretty common, but supposedly it was known that this was the ossuary that belonged to the high priest. That this was Caiaphas's ossuary. And to be that close to the remains of this man who was so vital to the story, not a good guy, of course, but who was so vital to the story of our Lord's crucifixion and the interaction that he had with the Jewish leaders, was really something else to me. Well, I'm imagining, based on that experience, that those who somewhere along the line, as they're traveling on their way to the Promised Land, maybe cast their eyes, and maybe it didn't happen until afterwards. Maybe there was an aha moment for people as they heard this story. Oh, that's the box. That box that I saw on that sort of almost a place of honor on that particular wagon that was especially close to Moses while we were traveling. Maybe there's that aha moment. That must be the one. But what I want you to see, just like we talked about before, remember we talked about how absolutely surprising, shocking, stunning it is that in Moses' account of the history of God's people, especially narrowing that down to his account of the life of Abraham, that Moses takes the time to tell the story of Abraham buying a burial plot for his wife. I've read lots of biographies. I've got a bookshelf full of biographies, and never once have I ever read a biography that includes the story of a man buying a burial place for his wife, except for in the book of Genesis. And we've talked about, why is that there? Well, that's there. This is why it's so important for us to remember that the story is being told by someone to someone in particular circumstances. That story is there to remind the people that Abraham had made a down payment on the Promised Land. That Abraham had put down earnest money. That Abraham had been sure and certain that those people who would descend from him, that would be more than the stars in the sky, would come back to this land. And here we see the same thing again. This time with Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Promise me, Joseph, promise me, son, that you're going to take my bones, because we are going. You understand, this is roughly 400 years away from this journey. And that means, in part, that this promise, this vow that Joseph makes, has to be passed down from generation to generation. There had to be someone in the family along the way, in the midst of that slavery, in the midst of that hardship, century after century of all that hardship, there had to be someone who could see the ossuary of Jacob and remember, oh, I know why that's there. Jacob made Joseph promise to take it to the promised land. We're going to the promised land. Again, we miss that ache for the fulfillment of that promise, because for us, our experience is essentially three experiences when we're reading the Bible. There's the events that are being described and the people therein. There's the person who's telling the story and the people who are first hearing the story. And then there's us. It takes us 10 minutes to get through this part of the story. But it's going to take them centuries to get to the place where the bones that were promised would be delivered to the promised land even begin their journey. And then we move into the book of Exodus, and we move into the failure of God's people to go and take the land, and we move into the 40 years of wandering. There's a longing, and I believe that we are called to have that same longing. Do you regularly contemplate the fullness of the promises of God? Do you spend time meditating on what the eternity that Jesus has won for you will be, about what our promised land will look like, about what it will mean to enter into the land of rest? You see, that hope is what sustains us. That's why I believe when we come to the Lord's table, we sort of step out of our time and into the fullness of the kingdom. We step into the marriage feast of the Lamb. We get a taste of what's coming, of the closeness of our Lord. Friends, have a hunger. Have a desire, have an eagerness and a zeal and a passion for what we see as the end of the story. But what we should know is the beginning of the story.